Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not.
Yes, thanks for that, Barry. This morning, Australia and Sri Lanka announced a new relationship to limit people smuggling, and Kevin Rudd announces his political retirement. What will our former Prime Minister be remembered for? To bat these issues around, I have three guests. One is on the way in just a moment, but with me right now is the editor of Politics Oz, the monthly's daily politics newsletter, Nick Fyke, and also Jane Gilmore, the editor of the King's Tribune. Jane, Nick, welcome to the program again.
Thank you.
I think you've done this more than I have, so I'll just let you roll with it. But let's discuss this announcement first overnight out of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Sri Lanka, which has not been attended, by the way, by all Commonwealth heads, that the Abbott government will now be entering into a new memorandum of understanding with Sri Lanka, including and involving both navies working very closely together to stop people smuggling. And the first gesture of this stronger relationship is us handing over to them two retired Navy patrol boats, which will be used to help turn asylum seekers back before they reach international waters. Jane, can I start with you? How do you feel about that?
I think Abbott's suffering from the problem that we all knew was going to happen. Was in the lead up to the election, he's been oversimplifying extremely complex debates, and now he's actually in government and having to deal with these very, very complex issues and can't solve it with a three-word slogan. So you can't stop the boats. That was never going to happen. The issue is far more complex than that. But I do think that cutting back on foreign aid while at the same time handing over military assets to a government with clear human rights violation issues is just difficult to defend, even in a simple way.
I might invite our third guest, who's just entered through the doorway into the conversation, and with me as well is the economist and columnist with the Australian, Judith Sloan. Judith, welcome to the show again.
Thanks very much.
And just to bring you up to speed, we're talking about this announcement overnight of the Abbott government giving the Sri Lankan government these two Navy patrol boats that have been retired from our Navy as part of the ongoing relationship of strength, the MOU with Sri Lanka, to deal with things like, well, asylum seekers leaving their waters. Your reactions to what you've heard overnight on that?
I'm sure the Labor government would have done it too.
Nick?
I think Abbott is relying on the fact that Australians don't know very much about the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. As you said before, there's a lot of heads of state that aren't even attending the CHOGM meeting because of two, but nevertheless, the human rights concerns that people have about
I think it's actually three. Canada, Mauritius and India.
Oh, Mauritius.
Yeah,
wow.
yeah.
I think the human rights issues that people are raising in relation to Sri Lanka are real, and I think it's one thing to say we want to judge Sri Lanka. I mean, I don't agree with this position, but it's one thing to say we're not going to judge other people on their situation on the ground. I think it's another thing entirely to assist a foreign government to suppress the rights of people in their own state. Essentially what we're saying is we will assist people from stopping refugees from escaping.
Well, what complicates the situation as well is that some members of the Navy have already been charged with aiding in people smuggling by the Sri Lankan government, and there's further investigations and charges due to be laid. So, Judith Sloan, do you think it's politic, both locally, domestically for the Abbott government and also internationally at CHOGM, to be undertaking that kind of behaviour when these kinds of revelations are coming to light?
Well, I mean, I think what people have to understand, and speaking as economists, this is all fungible, right? We could give them money and they could buy patrol boats, or we can give them patrol boats. You know, like it's really no different.
Perhaps an option would be not so much giving them military assets as using that money for other things that might make a difference.
But it's all fungible. Do you understand that? So, you know...
I do understand that. I'm saying that the problem is that this is what the Abbott government has chosen to spend the money on, and you're quite right, whether they give them a boat or they give them the money to buy a boat, they're still talking about military assets being used against an oppressed people. Well, even David Cameron's calling them out.
Maybe, but it's not really our problem, and we do have a problem in terms of asylum seekers coming here in quantities that clearly the population doesn't like. We voted in that direction.
Well, that's
and
because
therefore
most people don't understand what's happening.
Absolutely disagree. People absolutely understand, and they don't like it.
If you're looking at the actual numbers of people who are coming to Australia and the amount of money that we have to fund those people and to help them, the debate is ridiculous and uninformed.
It's enormous.
Can I just
Absolutely enormous. We've spent $10 billion. We've had 50,000.
Well, when it comes to Sri Lanka, can I
Asylum
just
seeker
add...
arrivals, it's way out of control.
When it comes to the Sri Lankan situation with asylum seekers, the Fairfax media is reporting today that they had contact with the Sri Lankan police, who say that the diminution in the number of asylum seekers leaving that country is not due to enforced border protection, but in fact the fact they've cracked down on some of these smuggling rings involving the Sri Lankan Navy internally in the country.
Yeah, but it's always going to be more complex like that. I mean, clearly the Indonesian police were involved in, there was complicity with the people smugglers. I mean, but, that's their issues, isn't it? I mean, we're not going to actually try and intervene at that level, are we? So, basically what we have to do is provide a deterrent for people arriving by boat and at the same time provide an orderly asylum a refugee program. And I think, there was bipartisan support for that proposition.
Nick Fyfe, do you think that this move from the Abbott government, the signing of the MOU due to happen in the next small time, and the donation of these boats is going to run well in the local electorate?
I just think that there's a fine line that in terms of how governments act in foreign policy terms, involving themselves in the domestic politics of other countries, and when it's to help them, as Jane said, oppress their own people. I think it's a real...
But these boats are part of an international effort involving people smuggling. You could argue this is not a domestic issue. It's more a border protection issue involving a couple of other nations.
Yeah, but as we said before, there are ways of dealing with situations, with refugee problems. There's a military way, there are civil and social ways, and in the past Australia's had a fair amount of success in Sri Lanka by spending money on civil, social and educational programs. And I think we're swinging in exactly the opposite direction that we should, and I just think it's morally really problematic.
All right, well, let's move on to another announcement of more recent times this week in Parliament, and a man who we all know very well.
Mr Deputy Speaker, there comes a time in our lives as parliamentarians when our families finally say enough is enough. The truth of this place is that the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, which regrettably have become part of the stock and trade for so many of us in public life, hit home to our families as well. For our family, recent statements since the September election have been particularly hurtful. My family have given their all for me in public life and for the nation. And it's now time I gave something back to them.
Jane Gilmore, what is our take-home message from the Rudd legacy? What's he left behind for us to remember?
I think the saddest thing about Rudd going was that it didn't happen 5 years before it did. He was the walking embodiment of all mouth and no trousers and the most destabilising force in Australian politics for the last 20 years. I think he brought almost no value at all and did an enormous amount of damage, and I'm glad he's gone.
Other parts of Outsiders panel?
Well, that little speech didn't, I say, honestly. Oh, my poor family and everything. I mean, what? So other workers' families aren't somehow participating in those persons' careers too? People say hurtful things, I mean, it's politics, mate. And in fact, the only thing he was possibly good at was politics, and only then for a short time. He was absolutely hopeless at policy. I mean, he just, was forever announcing things. It was completely unfeasible. It was just, there was no follow-through. And then he was on to the next thing. I mean, the sort of train wrecks that you see in his kind of policy aspirations. I mean, health and hospitals, rubbish.
Well, can you draw anything positive from this Judas Sloan? Is there anything about his reign in government that you will always remember fondly?
No.
Okay.
Well, no. Look, for newspaper commentators, he was a gift that kept on giving. So, I miss him in that regard.
Right. Okay. From a professional sense, Nick Fyfe?
Look, I think Kevin Rudd, whether we like it or not, was an important political figure in Australia. As I say, I generally agree with what you both said so far. But in my view, I mean, I think you can't underestimate the importance of the national apology. I think that was a real moment. It was historical. It changed the debate in Australia about how we talk about Indigenous issues. I think the National Broadband Network was substantial and important.
Really?
I do. And I know you'll disagree, but I do.
Yeah, great.
And I think his, what's the word he uses, stewardship of the economy through the GFC was universally recognised, or should I say internationally recognised, as being an extremely effective response to what happened in 2008.
Although some of the capital works that Rudd government invested in...
said internationally.
Not internationally recognised.
Well, some of the capital works that he was using to inject our economy with much-needed dollars, from his perspective, came to rack and ruin.
And again, I recognise that there's disagreement on this, but in the basic statistics show that Australia didn't go into recession during that time. We maintained low unemployment through that time, and essentially we continued as usual.
Ever since.
Again, you know, there's disagreements on these things. And I just wanted to, you know, for the sake of the conversation, at least mention some of the things that Kevin Rudd did do while he was the Prime Minister. But I think, in some ways, strangely, the most important change that he brought is, I think Kevin Rudd was the first Australian 21st century politician. I think he actually changed.
What does that mean?
Well, in the sense that people had a personal connection with him. He brought social media into the political debate. This notion of sort of politicians as celebrities, which I know a lot of people don't like, but his engagement in the 24-hour news cycle, his running a presidential campaign, all of these things were new.
But isn't that what Jane was saying initially? All mouth, no trousers?
Possibly, but I think it's a substantial figure, whether or not we like it.
But I'm not sure that's even right. I guess that's because you're so young. But, you know, like, people love Bob Hawke. I mean, he was a celebrity. I mean, he was a celebrity when he was the ACTU president.
He had Keating backing him up. And so you can afford to be a celebrity when you've got a treasurer like Keating standing behind you managing the economy. And Hawke also had some ideas on policy, he had some vision, and he had some understanding of the greater management of the Australian politics.
I totally agree with you, but I'm just disputing the point that, and I mean, in my parents' era, I mean, Bob Menzies was a celebrity too. I mean, I was about 5 in my puff sleeve dress being dragged along to the Morgan Town Hall to see Bob Menzies.
And how was that, Judith?
It was pretty boring for me, actually, but I do remember it.
Right.
But, you know, for my parents and my grandparents' era...
It's all scale, isn't it?
Bob Menzies was a celebrity to them.
If you've just joined us, this is The Outsiders, and our guests today are the editor of the King's Tribune, Jane Gilmore, editor of Politics Oz, Nick Fyke, and economist Judith Sloan. Judith, can we talk to you now about the debt ceiling?
Oh,
Now, and this has been a constant, across the floor of the new parliament. It's just been banging on and on and on. And I must say, as an outsider and a non-economist, I'm trying to work out what the point is. I mean, Labor's saying, well, we might let you go to $500 million worth of debt if you show us the books. And Joe Hockey's saying this is a US-style, you know, crisis on our hands if you don't let us get what we want. Should we care?
Well, I mean, there's a sort of sense in which at a technical level we shouldn't care. I guess there's a sense in which we should care about careful spending and revenue measures. So I think we should care about that a lot. But we never had a debt ceiling. Technically speaking, it
doesn't mean anything, does it?
Well, okay, in America, they don't have a budget. It's like a weird system, right? So they have appropriations, and then they have to have a separate device to establish the debt ceiling. We don't have that arrangement. We have a different piece of legislation which confers the authority on the government to issue bonds, basically. And so we never had a debt ceiling. It was Wayne Swan, bless his little heart, who brought in the idea of the debt ceiling.
And then promptly asked for permission to increase it.
I know. No, look, I mean, you know, he was not a good treasurer. But the real point is that I think actually Joe Hockey's been hoist on his petard on this thing, because I think what he wanted to do was that, we've got to raise the debt ceiling from 300 billion to 500 billion, and it's all your fault, Labor. And then I guess in the hope in the next 3 years, possibly in the next 6 years, he will never have to go back to Parliament do what is actually not technically needed, but to go to $500 billion if they kind of get quite ambitious with the spending stuff. So I just see it more as politics. But then, again, the other side of playing bad politics too, because, I mean, I think the idea that Labor would want to prosecute the topic of debt and deficit from opposition is probably a bit silly.
Nick Fike? Yeah, I agree with Judith in the sense that I think this is all political theatre. It's about posturing, it's about the first week of Parliament, and essentially the Liberal Party are trying to get 3 or 4 years out of this, and they're only being offered 2 years of increasing the debt. So essentially, $100 billion, which is what the Labor Party are offering, would get the debt to 2016 or something like that, and Joe Hockey's saying this is not enough, we want more room, more headroom, but really we're nowhere near the American situation. I think that analogy of the Tea Party was ludicrous, and in some respects, if there was a Tea Party analogy, it should be applied to the Liberal Party, because they're the ones who are saying that they would cut spending if we hit this fictional debt limit.
Well, the US version is, I think, a fiscal cliff. I mean, this isn't even a gentle slope. We can trot down this. I mean, Jane, I know that Ross Garnaut in the press over the weekend in launching his new book was saying, look, it's time to move on past this kind of terminology, and sure, accountability is everything, and maybe the Parliament, or the government in this case, should give us some indicators as to why the debt ceiling should be increased, if that needs to happen. Just be accountable, that's all.
I agree with that, but I also think that I'm going to defer to Judith on the economics of it, but the politics of it seems a bit silly to me, because if they're squabbling in front of the electorate over $100 billion, most people's eyes are going to glaze over. That money at that amount is almost meaningless. So it looks either like they're fighting over something meaningless, or they're fighting over something so huge that the rest of us can't understand it. And the politics of it doesn't play well either way, from either side. So they both lose. I don't understand why they got into the fight in the first place from a political point of view.
So, Judith, how do you think this is going to play out for the rest of the term? Is it just going to keep meandering on, or is there going to be a resolution? What's going to happen?
Well, you know, I'd like the political discourse, you see, I'm getting very ABC here, to shift in the direction of us really thinking about what government should do, what government should spend money on, and what is the most efficient and fair way to raise the revenue. The thing is, with all that stuff about debt ceilings and tea parties and stuff, you lose all that. You just completely lose all that. And, you know, I think there is certainly a segment of the population who wants to sort of see some rationalisation of entitlements. And so I'd like to have that debate.
Well, maybe we will. Maybe we will. In the meantime, thank you all very much indeed for jumping in here on a Sunday morning to take part in Outsiders. Nick Fike, Judith Sloan, Jane Gilmore, I'm sure you'll return when Jonathan's in the chair. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
It's time to go to the Institute now. And here he is, first dog on the moon.
Welcome to First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living. I'm Walkley Award-winning cartoonist, First Dog on the Moon. Thank heavens we sent Tony to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Sri Lanka. He looks so poised, striding the world stage. Well, I'm sure he'll grow into it. On today's guide, we have a good news story, although it doesn't start well. Prime Minister Abbott, Tony, to his friends, has been unkindly criticised for his comments at Choggum about torture, specifically when he said, while our government deplores the use of torture, we accept that sometimes, in difficult circumstances, difficult things happen. You see, what all you anti-torture do-gooders don't seem to understand is that, well, to paraphrase Tony himself, torture happens. Wasn't it Cardinal Pell who said, if it doesn't kill you, it will make you stronger? Or perhaps it was Crocodile Dundee. I don't recall, but that's not the point anyway. Everyone's misunderstood the Prime Minister, and there's always a first time. You see, People from Syria or Afghanistan or Iran or especially Sri Lanka who climb into the boats are fleeing torture, death threats, even unpleasant wars, although, of course, some of those scamps are just so-called economic migrants daring to try and find a better life rather than live in grinding poverty until they die. Cheeky buggers. Whatever they're fleeing, the kind and thoughtful souls in our very own Department of Immigration and Border Protection have got their best interests at heart. They're doing everything they can to make illegal boat arrivals feel welcome because just like at home, we're torturing them as well. Obviously, it's not quite the same. We're not electrocuting anyone's genitals or raping their daughters in front of them, although why you'd need to flee that in the first place is beyond me. But we are locking them away in deplorable conditions with no hope whatsoever. And here's the good news. Because we're causing such enormous psychological anguish to people locked in detention, folk who were already traumatised are now suffering even more through lack of reasonable or even slightly unreasonable care. These people are now so desperate, they're self-harming. That's right, Australia. They're torturing themselves. This is what we've managed to achieve. They don't need the Taliban anymore. They don't need the Sri Lankan security forces to torture them. They don't need the Australian government to torture them. Who've taught these people to torture themselves? If you break a man's jaw with a fish, he'll suffer for a while, but if you teach him how to cut his own flesh, he can torture himself for life. I think that's how the saying goes. This is about empowerment and self-determination. All right, it isn't. But finally, these people are learning a useful skill and also what a gracious and kind nation we are. Perhaps when Tony said, we accept that sometimes in difficult circumstances, difficult things happen, he wasn't talking about the Sri Lankan government disappearing people, he was talking about us. And when I say us, I mean us. Although I do wonder if it occurred to him at any point that the best way to stop the boats might be to help stop the difficult circumstances in which difficult things happen. Speaking out against it might be a start. Whatever. But instead, we seem to be getting crueler every day. Still, they keep coming. They just keep coming. And everyone keeps on trying to avoid difficult things happening. Thanks for listening, Patriots. This has been First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living, brought to you by the First Dog on the Moon Institute. Oh, thank you, Dog, and he'll be back at the same time.
There you go. Wasn't that fascinating? I suppose we can look forward to the traditional consequence of having bad government, which institutes bad policy, which means that the environment shits all over the people who voted for the bad government, so the extreme weather will come gunning for the Tony Abbott, Warren Truss, Barney Baby Joyce voters' support base, won't it? Hey? It is traditional. You offend the gods, and then the gods get back at the offensiveness, and then the crops fail, and then when the crops fail, the peasants revolt and throw out the offensive government.
To severe hailstorms that pounded southeast Queensland yesterday. The worst hit area was the Sunshine Coast, where there were hailstones the size of cricket balls. Hundreds of cars and homes were damaged, several people were hurt. Steve Waddell from the SES says the weather system is keeping authorities busy.
It is actually SES week throughout Australia this week, and we were at an awards ceremony in Gympie, and about a quarter of the audience had to get up and go and work and respond to the request. And we ended up with about 206 requests. Some are still coming through as people come home after the storms. Majority of those were around the Maroochydore area.
Australian all-rounder Shane Watson is unlikely to bowl.
And they didn't mention it on that bulletin, but on previous bulletins, as well as southeast Queensland getting hammered, Coffs Harbour got hammered, the Sunshine Coast got hammered, basically the tourist-trapped coastal belt got hammered. I think there were 360 requests for help to the SES in Coffs Harbour alone in northern New South Wales. I had 1/4 millimetre yesterday afternoon in a couple of short sun showers. And I watched all the storms brew up around here and then set sail for the north and northeast. So, yeah, it's a curious phenomenon, but Gay's revenge is hammering the people who voted for the Liberal Nazi Party. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.